Paul, as we've been walking through Philippians, is sitting in prison and relying on the generosity of people who follow that commandment in Deuteronomy, people who give to him, in particular an individual by the name of Epaphroditus, who we'll come to learn about in a few weeks. And Paul, in turn, is going to share in this passage about the generosity he's able to give and the things that he's able to provide. I've encouraged you to look at this passage, this poem from chapter 2, verses 6 through 11, which I've enabled you by putting on the back of your bulletin for the people who don't open their Bibles, because I want you to know it. I want you to memorize it. I want you to sing it and it to get stuck in your head and eventually get stuck in your heart, that you might not sin against God, because this is the executive summary of Philippians in a poetic form. Everything that Paul's going to say in Philippians is going to go back, or in this case, look forward to this beautiful poem. And in this case, it's going to be the idea that Jesus did it first that we're going to be looking at. We'll be talking about death, and I want to remind you that when we talk about death, we talk about the death of Christ. Hear now the word of the Lord in the epistle to the Philippians, chapter 1, verses 12 to 26. I want you to know, beloved, that what has happened to me has actually helped to spread the gospel, so that it's become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ. And most of the brothers and sisters, having been made confident in the Lord by my imprisonment, dare to speak the word with greater boldness and without fear. Some proclaim Christ from envy and rivalry, but others from goodwill. These proclaim Christ out of love, knowing that I have been put here for the defense of the gospel. But others proclaim Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, but intending to increase my suffering in my imprisonment. What does it matter? Just this, that Christ is proclaimed in every way, whether out of false motives or true, and in that I rejoice. Yes, I will continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this will result in my deliverance. It is my eager expectation and hope that I will not be put to shame in any way, but that by my speaking with all boldness, Christ will be exalted, now as always, in my body, whether by life or by death. For to me, living is Christ, and dying is gain. If I'm meant to live in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. And I don't know which I prefer. I'm hard-pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better, but to remain in the flesh is more necessary for you. Since I'm convinced of this, I know that I'll remain and continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that I may share abundantly in your boasting in Christ Jesus when I come to you again. This is the word of the Lord. So, Mr. Schramm, my public speaking professor undergrad, marked me down 10 points because my speech didn't have a hook. I still remember that. You're supposed to start with a joke or something, he said. Well, I thought it'd be fun, since we've got two distinct audiences and age groups gathered in the room, to start with a story that would completely date me to both groups. Let's see if I can do this, all right? So, before I started high school, the year before I started, actually, so the same calendar year, I was in 8th grade, and an event happened that totally transformed what my expectations were, what the conversation was going to be about as I entered high school. It was an event called the Columbine High School Massacre. How did I do? Do I seem impossibly young over here? And do I seem terribly old to you guys? Okay. The Columbine High School massacre absolutely radically changed what high school meant to American kids. I mean, it used to be that when we talked about high school, we'd be talking about athletic facilities, right? And Irvine High had the best theater, but Uni had the best pool, and suddenly the conversation became about metal detectors. It used to be, this was in California, we had earthquake drills, which if you do an earthquake drill, what you have to do, in case you're wondering, you get down, you get as low to the ground as you can, and you try to cover yourself with something and then make your way to a doorway. And those, we got rid of those. Suddenly we had school shooting drills, which if you're curious, what you want to do is you want to get down, and then you want to cover yourself and make your way to a doorway. If that happens here, that's our policy. That's what we do. It was the beginning of a cultural shift in this country, away from a sense of safety and prosperity in the 90s, where we had the dot-com boom, and everyone's getting rich, and everything's just getting better, and suddenly we shifted towards fear. And everyone was telling us kids what we should be afraid of, and what kind of bad people might want to hurt us. And that shift only got stronger in my sophomore year, to date myself again, with the 9/11 terror attacks. It changed the culture of the United States of America. And it became a predominant narrative in American life. I had never personally encountered anyone that wanted to kill me and was prepared to, but suddenly everyone wanted to talk to me about that. That was the conversation. And it's so pervasive, in fact, that they're looking at naming a generation after it. I don't know if you've heard this. So my generation is called the millennials. I'm one of the older millennials. It's kind of a misnomer. We say millennial to mean like kids these days, but millennials are 38. And then the next generation that follows after me, some have suggested calling them the Homeland generation. They're the generation raised in the era of Homeland Security. The generation that has never known a world before fear, before scanners in the airports that see through clothes, before the long lines and the Patriot Act. The students, if you're doing NSO next week, the students that are starting college this year were born after Columbine. It was the year after Columbine that they were born. So, in the church, that shift also took place, which is always dangerous, by the way. When you see the church following culture, that's a problem. And in the church, the shape of that change, the shape of that paranoia came with a sort of interest, and I would even use the word obsession, with martyrdom. Suddenly, you couldn't be the cool kid in youth group unless you had just a little bit of a Christ-sanctified death wish. Because you see, what had happened was there was one individual, one of the victims at Columbine, whose name was Cassie. And she was a Christian. She had renewed her faith as a believer recently. And one of the survivors heard one of the gunmen ask her, do you believe in God? And he heard her voice say yes. And then she was dead. She was killed. And so she was an American martyr. It was the first time we'd seen anything like that happen. Someone killed because they professed belief in Jesus Christ on American soil. Prior to that, I mean, we'd had like Confederate martyrs, but that was warfare. And so suddenly, she said yes was the book her mom wrote, and that was the question in every youth group, in every church gathering. Michael W. Smith wrote a song about it, and DC Talk had a book. It was called Jesus Freaks. Every minor Christian celebrity that was cool at the time was dealing with this question of, what are you going to do? What are you going to do if someone comes to your school and asks you to believe in Jesus? and says that if you say you do believe in Jesus, if you don't deny Christ, I'm going to kill you, how are you going to respond? I want to give you a taste of that. I want to try to experience orthopathos with you, to have the same ecstatic experience I had. So would you please imagine going to your school or going to a place you go regularly, and imagine someone coming in. Imagine what they look like. Imagine what they smell like. Think about where you would hide. And then imagine them asking you, if anyone in this room is a Christian, stand up, I'm going to kill you. Would you say yes? Would anyone say yes? Say yes. If you're a Christian, say yes. Shout it out. Yes. Shout it out. You're dead. You're dead. Anyone else? Anyone else? Say it. Do it. Even if you wouldn't actually say yes in the time, say yes now. Experience this with me. Yes, I'm a Christian. Right? That's what it felt like. Did you get a little bit of a rush out of it? Do you feel, man, if only it were so easy. If only it were so easy. I fantasized about that kind of moment. That if I could be given the opportunity to be a martyr, then I could be a hero. I could go down in history. They'd write books about me and how wonderful the faith of Ryan Gaffney was because I said yes once, and then I died. There's just a little wrinkle with that. There's one little problem. There are some things that are good about that, and I'll get to those, but that's not actually what happened at Columbine. See, what had happened was Cassie died. She was shot because the shooters were evil and they were shooting people. And there was another individual by the name of Valine who was shot, and she said, oh God, because she was shot. And the shooter said, do you believe in God? And Valine said, yeah, my parents raised me that way. And so the shooter said, okay, and respected that decision and left. Presumably, the shooter knew he was about to meet God before long, and was reasonably interested in that. So Cassie died in an act of senseless violence, not an act of martyrdom, and it was an honest mistake on the part of the survivor who was grieving the loss of his friend and the mother who heard the story, but it didn't actually happen. In fact, that story it's a fabrication. It's never really happened that way, at least not here. The kind of wild gunmen shooting Christians because they're Christians. A similar thing happened in Oregon where a gunman was asking people what they believe and saying, well, you'll go to heaven then. But he was killing everyone. He wasn't just killing the Christians. And so we've created this myth for ourselves in the Christian subculture, this martyrdom myth, this persecution mentality. And I talked in the last series, if you've been here, about the importance of myths and the fact that myths are valuable, but it's also important to recognize that that's what it is. It's a story that we created. There's also one other problem, maybe important, might be worth considering with this kind of martyrdom mentality. It's kind of the opposite of what the Bible says. Like just a little bit diametrically opposed to what Paul is saying right here in the first chapter of the Philippians. You see, Paul is imprisoned. He's put in jail by the kind of people who really do kill Christians because they're Christians, right? By the Roman government. And by the way, if you look at the history of martyrdom over the Christian experience, and indeed the Christian presence of martyrdom, it's usually the governments that are the problem. It's usually the police of the corrupt nations that are putting Christians in jail, and that happens, and it happens now, and that's part of why it's disrespectful to fetishize that and kind of claim that when it's not ours, and there are Christians suffering, and the Philipians are in that boat. Every single Christian, from the greatest to the least in Philippi, knows that their commitment to Jesus Christ has put a target at their head, and that they could die or they could be thrown in jail any minute. And Paul is dealing with that same question. And here's what he says. He says, it's pretty good. I like it, this imprisonment. In fact, I'm rejoicing. It's been a good opportunity for me to witness to the guards. The guards are hearing the gospel, and so I've had a first opportunity to kind of share with them. And then the fact that I'm absent is great because it creates a vacuum, right? Have you ever done that in your ministry work? Have you ever walked away from something on purpose in order to get newer, younger leaders to step up? That works. And so Paul's like, yeah, it's great. So I left, and then other people started preaching even more. So I'm preaching, and they're preaching, and I'm not worried. Because what would I be worried about? I'm not afraid that any kind of climactic event is going to happen, because here's the thing. The worst thing they could do to me is set me free. If they set me free, then I've got to go back to work. Then I've got to suffer. Then I've got to have difficult conversations with people about Jesus. And I'll say, yeah, I believe in one God. And they'll say, yeah, I think you're an atheist. And I'll have to deal with that. And traveling from town to town, it's tiring, Philippians. Or they could kill me, and then I'll go to heaven. It's exactly the opposite thinking. It's not, oh boy, I hope I get a chance to take a stand. It's, I'm taking a stand. I'm either going to take a stand at rest or alive. That's what to live is Christ, to die is gain really means. We love that phrase. We repeat it, right? To live is Christ, to die is gain. It's cool. It sounds good in English. To blank is blank. To blank is blank, right? We can put any kind of catchphrase there. It's got that pop. But what it really comes down to meaning is that living is harder than dying. That's what Paul's saying. Living is harder than dying. And I'm afraid that we've got people in this room who would readily die for Jesus Christ, but might not readily live for him. I believe that we've got people in this room, and if you're not at that place yet in your faith, I want you to get there, right? But I appreciate that, right? If you've got growing to do yet before you're ready to lay your life down, this is the right place to be. Keep coming back, right? But if you're there, that you would give your life for Jesus Christ, would you also risk your life for Jesus Christ? We're cooking for the college kids today. We're going to have leftovers. I'm going to go down to Pine Hills and give them out to hungry people. Do you want to come with me? Or does that sound too dangerous? Because it makes no sense that if it's something that Jesus wants done, that danger would be a factor. I believe that there are people in this room. I believe that there are people in this room who love Jesus enough that they would, even recognizing that they will never see their family again if they are killed, would willingly stand up for a testimony that may never get told. To say, yes, I believe, and maybe there are no witnesses. You would do that, and you would never see your family again. But would you inconvenience your family for Jesus Christ? Would you take an extra trip around the block? Would you maybe disrespect your family? Go against their wishes for you in your career? if it's something that Jesus really wants, if it's something that goes with the teachings of the Bible. I think there are people who would and then wouldn't. And I worry about that because that's hypocrisy. If I die, that's easy. But if I live, then I've got to do work. Dying is an alternative to being a Christian. It's an alternative. You can either do that or you can be a Christian. And I want you to be a Christian. And that's the true part. That's the true part of that myth. It's the true part of that story that I was raised on. It's why I'm not particularly upset that people have been influenced by She Said Yes and they've been inspired, is because if someone has surrendered their whole life to Jesus, if someone has really gotten used to that idea that our bodies are living sacrifices, then they should indeed be ready to die if such a thing were going to happen, which is completely unlikely. Unless, you go to the Middle East or you go to, you could get arrested for it in China. There have been not really any killings. You should be ready if you've given your life. That's what it means to give your life. But the importance of being ready isn't to be ready. It's not for it to happen. That's not an end in and of itself. The importance of being ready is because if you're ready, that should also prepare you to live. It should prepare you to live and to do stuff and to suffer. Because Jesus not only died, Jesus suffered. The fact that Jesus died it's unprecedented. Gods weren't supposed to do that. He was the first God ever to do that. And if you want to follow this God, you've got to know that that's a possibility for you in Philippi. But the reason you've got to know that's a possibility is because that sets you on a radical track with what you do until then. Suffer so that you can help other people not to suffer, like Jesus did. And so, then, therefore, I have another exercise for you. And this one is a lot less hypothetical. This additional orthopathos exercise, this additional ecstatic opportunity to feel what something's like. It's the start of a new school year. And I believe that the start of a new school year is really a more of a new year than the new year. January 1st is, But even if you're not in school anymore, when the kids go back to school, it resets all of us. The rising tide rises all the boats, And in fact, in the Jewish calendar, Rosh Hashanah is coming up. It's that harvest festival, the Jewish New Year. So for Paul and his people, they were ready for renewal right about this time. You're going to have a new year. And in the new year, you're going to have new opportunities. And for the IV leaders here, I want to talk to you alone for a minute. You guys are going to be missionaries. You're going to be going out onto a campus that desperately needs the love of Jesus and that desperately wants you to compromise. That desperately wants you to be like, okay, but why don't you split your time between your Christian club and your music club and your study group, right? Will you give it all to Jesus this year? As you envision your year, and I want to be clear, I'm not asking you to give it all to InterVarsity, right? Will you give InterVarsity and your major classes, and your work, and the stuff you do for recreation, your video games, and your Snapchats, will you give all of that to Jesus and participate it as a ministry this year? Will you? Say it out loud. Say it out loud. Will you give it to Jesus this year? Yes. 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 Now the rest of y'all, are you excited by that? Is that at all exciting by you? Are there any of you that kind of wish, man, I wish I could do that too. I wish I could be a college student and go everywhere I go as a missionary. Say yes if you would. Yes. I got good news. You can. You can go as a missionary everywhere, and if you don't know what the first step is, if you're not sure how you would do that, talk to one of them. Talk to one of them. These are the leaders of InterVarsity. You think like Russell and Camara are in charge? Russell and Camara are like fake in charge, right? These kids know how to live as missionaries on campus, and if you sit down with one of them at lunch, which you should break them up and keep them from all sitting together, right? Grab one, pull them to your table and say, all right, what's my step one? Pretend I'm a new Christian that joined InterVarsity. Pretend I'm a new freshman. How do I reach my neighborhood the way you reach your campus? And learn from them. In fact, even if you're not in that ecstatic group, even if you're not in the group that's like, I wish I could do this, you're thinking, that sounds like hard work, I'm not sure if I'm going to do that, at least look at them. Will you guys stand up for a second? Stand up. Look at these missionaries. Look at their faces. Look at how happy they are. Look at how much of a difference they still think they can make. They haven't been beaten down by the world. They're idealistic. They're going to change the campus, and by changing the campus, they're going to change the world. Right, guys? Yes. You can sit down. If you won't follow them, at least humble yourself enough to be inspired by them, to recognize that maybe you felt like that once, and maybe you don't anymore. And maybe that's not just because you're older and wiser and less reckless. That might be part of it. But maybe there's a piece of it that you're also more world-wearied and more discouraged. And you've had more people that were supposed to love you that didn't love you. And maybe there have been some losses in addition to the gains. Because if we can humble ourselves, then we're doing the third thing that Jesus did in that poem. Jesus not only gave his life for the salvation of humankind, and by dying on the cross, he not only gave his ministry, his actions, by serving people when he emptied himself, but he humbled himself. Taking on human likeness, though he possessed the right, the form of God, he didn't consider that something to be grasped, but he made himself nothing. He humbled himself. And if we humble ourselves, just like Jesus, we are going to be exalted. But that's a story for next week. For now, let's be exalted. Let's be lifted up by lifting our voices together to sing some songs about the life of Jesus whom we follow. My blessing to you, the thing that I want to leave you with, is this example of Paul following the example of Christ, who humbled himself, who lived, and who died, but especially who lived. And may that be an invitation to you, not of challenge, not of worry about what might possibly happen, but rather of freedom. That nothing can happen on campus or in the neighborhood that you're not ready for. The worst thing that can happen is you've got to do good work that blesses others. Amen? Amen. Bless you in Jesus Christ's name. And hope you'll join us for lunch.